It began with a quiet legal review inside Buckingham Palace, one document, one forgotten codicil, and one devastating discovery that reportedly left Queen Camilla distraught. What had been treated as routine paperwork suddenly became a royal earthquake. Because buried inside Charles's private instructions, lawyers allegedly found a clause that changed everything. Camilla's grandchildren were not included, and behind palace doors, that exclusion was no longer possible to ignore. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the review began with no intention of creating a crisis. It was meant to be procedural, careful, almost dull, the kind of legal housekeeping that surrounds an aging monarch, a complicated family, and a reign already weighed down by illness, duty, and unfinished questions. But in the House of Windsor, paperwork is never just paperwork. A signature can divide branches of a family. A clause can harden into history. A single line, written quietly and preserved inside private instructions, can reveal what years of public smiles were designed to conceal. According to Palace Whispers, lawyers were examining Charles's codicil and estate directions when they came across language that appeared to draw a firm line around certain legacy protections. It was not loud. It was not cruel in tone. That may have made it even more devastating. The wording allegedly did not attack Camilla's grandchildren, nor did it publicly name them for humiliation. Instead, it did something colder. It simply left them outside the protected circle. In royal terms, silence can be sharper than accusation. Omission can feel like judgment. For Camilla, the reported discovery was said to be deeply personal. She had spent decades climbing through suspicion, scandal, resistance, and public doubt to finally stand beside Charles as queen. She had endured the whispers, outlasted the hostility, and entered the center of royal life with a kind of hard-earned permanence. But this codicil allegedly reminded her that permanence inside the monarchy is never granted by affection alone. It is measured by bloodline, duty, constitutional need, and the unforgiving architecture of inheritance. Senior courtiers reportedly understood the danger immediately. This was not merely a question about grandchildren. It was about the boundary between Charles's private life and the monarchy's public trust. The Parker Bowles side of the family, long treated with courtesy but never folded fully into the Windsor line, was suddenly pulled into a painful debate about belonging. What had once been managed through tact and distance now appeared to be written into legal reality. And at the center of it stood Charles, caught in the most difficult position of all. As a husband, he could understand Camilla's pain. As king, he could not ignore the rules that protect the institution. Reports suggest aides moved quickly to contain the leak, aware that if the codicil became public, it would not simply wound Camilla, it could ignite a wider Windsor power struggle over legacy, legitimacy, and the future shape of the royal family. But the real shock was not simply who had been left out, it was why Charles may have written the codicil that way in the first place. For years, Camilla's position appeared secure, protected by marriage, ceremony, and the golden glow of the coronation. But a codicil is not a crown. It is colder, quieter, more final. And according to whispers moving through legal and palace circles, this particular codicil carried the one message Camilla never expected to confront. Affection did not automatically mean inheritance, and marriage did not rewrite bloodline. A codicil may sound harmless to those outside palace walls, almost like a small correction, a quiet note added to a larger document. But inside a royal household, it can carry the weight of a verdict. It does not need trumpets, ceremonies, or public declarations. It works in silence. It changes meaning after the ink has dried. It can preserve, protect, exclude, or expose. And that is why this reported discovery struck with such force. Because if the will is the broad statement of intention, the codicil is the sharper blade, the private adjustment that reveals what the author believed still needed to be guarded. Reports suggest Charles's legacy planning had been shaped by more than sentiment. It had to survive scrutiny, precedent, and the brutal mathematics of monarchy. The crown is not built like an ordinary family estate, where affection alone decides the future. It is surrounded by trusts, protections, public expectations, duchies, archives, royal residences, and generations of inherited duty. Every instruction carries a shadow. Every beneficiary raises a question. Every exclusion creates pain. And in that delicate legal machinery, Charles allegedly appeared to separate the man from the monarch, the husband from the sovereign, and the private household from the sacred Windsor line. That distinction may be what devastated Camilla most. Because to her, the Parker Bowles grandchildren were not political symbols. They were family. They were part of her private life, her softer world, the side of her existence untouched by court circulars and constitutional language. But to palace lawyers, according to whispers, they represented something far more complicated. The point at which personal affection could begin to look like dynastic extension. And once that concern enters legal planning, every word becomes dangerous. The wording reportedly identified by lawyers was not described as emotional or vindictive. Instead, it was said to be precise, almost clinical, designed to protect Windsor-linked assets and certain legacy structures from any interpretation that might later be stretched beyond bloodline. Palace insiders have suggested that this was not an act of personal cruelty, but a move of constitutional caution. Yet caution can still wound. A protective clause can still feel like rejection when it lands on the people someone loves. Inside the culture of the monarchy, this kind of decision would not exist in isolation. It would pass through private briefings, legal memoranda, confidential reviews, and the old red box rhythm of royal paperwork, where state duty and family life often meet without mercy. And that is where the tension deepened. Did Camilla know the language existed before the lawyers raised it? Had Charles warned her? Or had she believed, until that moment, that her family's closeness to the king meant there would be some quiet shelter waiting for them in the future? Those questions reportedly unsettled the palace because they pointed to something larger than one family's hurt feelings. They suggested that Charles, even in weakness, may have understood the danger of leaving blurred lines behind him. He had spent his reign trying to steady an institution already battered by scandal, illness, exile, and public doubt. The last thing the monarchy could afford was a future inheritance dispute wrapped around the Parker Bowles name. And once the wording was read aloud, the palace reportedly understood that this was no ordinary inheritance issue. It was a boundary line drawn across the future of the monarchy. Camilla had survived scandal, suspicion, public rejection, and decades of royal pressure. But this was different. Reports suggest she was not confronted by shouting, cameras, or public humiliation only by a legal sentence with the power to wound more deeply than any headline. Her grandchildren, the innocent extension of her private world, had allegedly been written outside the royal safety net. And that realization broke the room's silence. For Camilla, the reported blow did not land first on her crown. It landed on her heart. Titles, ceremonies, balcony appearances, and carefully managed acceptance could not soften the meaning of what lawyers were said to have explained. This was not about whether she was respected as queen. It was about whether the people she loved beyond the palace gates had any lasting place inside the protection of Charles's legacy. And according to whispers from within royal circles, that distinction was almost unbearable. She had spent years being measured against history, judged against memory, and watched through the shadow of another woman's legacy. She had learned to endure the cold language of public opinion. But the language of inheritance was different. Public criticism could be dismissed. Headlines could fade. Polls could shift. But legal wording endures. It waits quietly in files and locked drawers, ready to speak when emotion no longer can. That is what reportedly made the moment so devastating. The Codicil did not argue with her. It simply stood there, final and unbending. Palace aides are said to have sensed the atmosphere change immediately. What had begun as a controlled legal briefing reportedly became heavy with discomfort, because everyone understood that this was not only a royal issue, it was a family wound. Camilla's grandchildren were not political operators. They were children and young adults connected to her private life, to birthdays, family tables, familiar voices, and the softer world she had tried to keep separate from the machinery of monarchy. Yet now, that private world had been pulled into the harsh light of royal planning. Charles's condition made the moment even more delicate. Reports suggest his health had already placed a solemn shadow over questions of legacy, succession, and final intention. In that context, every document felt heavier. Every legal explanation carried the quiet fear of time. Camilla was reportedly not simply reacting to an exclusion, she was facing the possibility that Charles had already prepared for a future where comfort would matter less than constitutional clarity. That realization cut deep, because it suggested that even his love had limits when placed beside the crown. According to palace whispers, Camilla allegedly asked whether the wording could be clarified, softened, or placed in a more compassionate frame. Not rewritten in a way that would provoke scandal, but adjusted enough to remove the sting. Yet lawyers reportedly warned that even a minor change could open a dangerous door. If the codicil seemed to blur the boundary between Windsor heirs and Parker Bowles' descendants, it could invite speculation, legal confusion, and public anger. In monarchy, one softened phrase can become tomorrow's crisis. That warning reportedly left Camilla isolated in a way few expected. She remained queen, but the codicil reminded her that queenship did not automatically extend dynastic shelter to everyone she loved. The Parker Bowles family, long adjacent to royal privilege, but never truly absorbed into royal inheritance, suddenly appeared exposed. Their closeness had been social, emotional, and domestic, but legally, it may have been temporary all along. And that was the fear said to settle over Camilla most sharply. That her family's place beside Charles had always depended on his presence, his protection, and his personal affection. Without him, the gates would not open wider. They might close. But as Camilla struggled with the personal pain of the discovery, others inside the palace saw something far larger. A final test of whether the crown belonged to duty or domestic loyalty. The moment the codicil surfaced, the old guard reportedly stopped treating it as a family matter. Princess Anne, Prince William, and Prince Edward understood the danger immediately. This was not only about Camilla's grandchildren, it was about precedent. If one private family branch could be folded into royal protection, where would the line end? And in Windsor history, lines are everything. Reports suggest Princess Anne saw the issue with brutal clarity. To others, it may have looked like a painful domestic matter involving a queen, a husband, and grandchildren caught in the shadow of royal law. But to Anne, the monarchy had never survived by surrendering its borders to emotion. It survived because someone, somewhere, was always willing to say no. And in this reported crisis, Anne became once again what palace insiders have long whispered she was. The iron guardian of royal boundaries, the one who understood that sentiment can be kind in private but dangerous when written into precedent. For William, the concern reportedly ran even deeper. He was not only thinking of Charles or Camilla, he was thinking of the reign to come. George, Charlotte, and Louis would one day inherit a monarchy shaped by the decisions made now, and any blurred line around royal protection could become their burden. If the Parker Bowles grandchildren were quietly folded into legacy arrangements today, what would stop another claim tomorrow? What would stop public anger from asking why private relatives had been protected while working royals were being reduced, scrutinized, and measured against every pound of privilege? Prince Edward, often quiet but never careless, was reportedly drawn into the matter through the fine print. His strength has always been restraint, the calm discipline of someone who understands that the most important palace battles are not always fought in public. They are fought through documents, schedules, access lists, legal readings, and carefully worded instructions. In that sense, Edward was said to view the codicil not as a weapon against Camilla, but as a defense mechanism for the monarchy itself. Soon, palace whispers began attaching a name to the strategy: the Windsor bloodline firewall. It sounded severe because it had to be severe. The idea was simple but unforgiving. Royal affection could remain generous, family kindness could continue. Private relationships could be respected, but inheritance, protection, and dynastic legitimacy had to remain sealed inside the Windsor line. Once that firewall cracked, the palace feared it would never fully close again. This was where Charles's pain became almost impossible to separate from his duty. Reports suggest he was caught between the woman he loved and the crown he was born to serve. To comfort Camilla too openly might suggest the codicil was negotiable. To stand by the wording too coldly might wound her beyond repair. Yet the old guard reportedly believed there was no middle ground. The monarchy could not be managed like a blended household. It had to be protected like an institution under siege. And so the codicil began to mean more than any one clause. It became a symbol of the firm before the family, duty before softness, inheritance before emotion. Camilla's distress remained real, but inside the palace, sympathy was not enough to change the calculation. And that was when the private grief surrounding Camilla turned into a bureaucratic counteroffensive that reportedly left her with fewer allies than ever. Behind the polished doors and careful statements, one question began spreading with dangerous speed. What exactly had the Parker Bowles family expected? Not publicly, not officially, but quietly, socially, emotionally. Reports suggest the codicil forced everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth that Camilla's children and grandchildren had lived near royal privilege without ever being royal heirs. Now, the paperwork allegedly made that distinction impossible to blur. According to Palace Whispers, the names Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes were never written at the center of the storm, yet they were pulled toward it by implication. They were Camilla's children, part of her private life long before she became queen, and through them came the grandchildren who reportedly made the discovery so painful. The issue was not whether they were loved. It was not whether Charles had shown warmth, generosity, or kindness over the years. The issue was whether closeness to the monarch could ever become closeness to the monarchy itself. And that question, once raised, became explosive. For years, the Parker Bowles connection had existed in a carefully managed space. Near the royal household, but not inside the royal bloodline. Present at certain moments, but not central to succession. Respected as family, but not treated as heirs. That distance may have seemed polite, even harmless, while Charles was strong enough to hold all sides together. But reports suggest the codicil made the arrangement suddenly feel less like tact and more like a warning. It clarified what courtiers had always known. Private affection does not automatically create public entitlement. Palace sources reportedly began drawing a sharp line between kindness and inheritance, between social courtesy and legal protection. Invitations could be extended. Family warmth could be shown. Personal bonds could remain untouched. But Windsor inheritance, according to the alleged wording, remained Windsor inheritance. It could not be diluted by marriage, softened by sympathy, or expanded through emotional pressure. That was the cold logic behind the document, and that logic reportedly sent a tremor through those who had assumed the palace would always find a way to cushion Camilla's family from discomfort. The concern inside William's circle was said to be particularly firm. His future reign would already carry enough pressure. A slimmed-down monarchy, public scrutiny, the shadow of past scandals, and the need to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis from inherited chaos. To allow any suggestion that Camilla's descendants might benefit from royal legacy structures could ignite public anger. It would feed the accusation that the monarchy protected private networks while asking the nation for trust. And for William, that risk reportedly became unacceptable. This is where the discovery turned from emotional wound into institutional alarm. If Camilla's influence could be expressed through legal protections for her wider family, even indirectly, then the old guard feared the crown's boundaries would begin to soften. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly through exceptions, gestures, and small allowances that later generations might struggle to undo. That fear left Camilla in a more fragile position than she may have expected. The codicil did not remove her title. It did not erase her marriage. But it reportedly reduced the reach of her influence in the one place that mattered most, the future. Her family could remain close to her, but not to the royal inheritance line. They could be treated with dignity, but not absorbed into dynastic protection. And in palace terms, that distinction was everything. But the more the Parker Bowles question spread, the more attention turned back to Charles and whether this codicil revealed his true final judgment. Charles had spent a lifetime balancing love against duty. But now, as reports suggest his private instructions came under legal scrutiny, that balance became almost unbearable. To Camilla, the codicil may have felt like rejection. To the institution, it looked like protection. And to Charles himself, it may have been the cruelest kind of decision. One made not because he lacked affection, but because he knew affection could not govern the crown. For Charles, the reported crisis cut through the oldest wound of his life, the space between what he wanted as a man and what was demanded of him as king. He had waited decades to marry Camilla openly, decades to bring her from the margins of royal controversy into the center of national ceremony. Her rise had been slow, painful, and constantly judged. Yet now, after all of that struggle, one legal clause allegedly exposed the limit of what even Charles could give her. He could give her recognition. He could give her loyalty. He could give her the dignity of queenship. But he could not, without consequence, rewrite the structure of Windsor inheritance around her private bloodline. Reports suggest Charles was emotionally conflicted, and perhaps more vulnerable than anyone around him wanted to admit. His health had already made every question of legacy feel more urgent. Every document carried a deeper shadow. Every instruction seemed to speak not only to the present, but to the reign that would follow him. In that atmosphere, the codicil was not merely a legal note. It was a message from a king who understood that time was no longer endless, and that uncertainty left behind could become war for those who remained. Lawyers reportedly advised that royal assets, protections, and legacy structures had to be shielded from any future interpretation involving blended family claims. The warning was not framed as hostility toward Camilla's grandchildren, but as a defense against confusion. The monarchy could not afford ambiguity. It could not allow private affection to be mistaken for dynastic entitlement. What might feel compassionate in the moment could become explosive later, especially under the glare of public suspicion and a media culture hungry for palace division. Yet Camilla, according to whispers, wanted reassurance that her family was not being erased. She was not asking for a revolution, not openly, not in a way that could be easily condemned. She wanted comfort. She wanted some sign that the people closest to her heart would not be treated as outsiders once Charles was gone. And that placed Charles in an almost impossible position. If he softened the meaning of the codicil, he risked weakening the very protection it was designed to create. If he defended it too firmly, he risked leaving Camilla feeling abandoned at the moment she most needed loyalty. William and Anne reportedly saw the matter with less emotional fog. To them, the wording had to stand. The future of George, Charlotte, and Louis could not be burdened by a disputed legacy line. The late Queen Elizabeth's memory was said to hover over the entire discussion, not as sentiment, but as discipline. Her lifelong lesson had been simple. The crown survives when duty wins over private desire. And Charles may have understood with painful clarity that this codicil could define his reign more sharply than any speech, balcony moment, or coronation vow. It was the place where love met law, and law did not bend. And as Charles hesitated, the palace machinery began moving on its own, proving that the monarchy does not wait for emotions to settle. Once the lawyers finished their review, the response was reportedly swift, silent, and unforgiving. No public announcement, no dramatic statement. Just internal clarification, restricted access, tightened language, and a renewed insistence that royal inheritance could not be softened by sentiment. The codicil had become a locked door, and Camilla, for perhaps the first time since becoming queen, was standing on the wrong side of it. Reports suggest the palace did what it often does in moments of danger. It did not explode outward, it hardened inward. The machinery tightened quietly. Language was checked. Assumptions were corrected. Private understandings were brought under review. It was not presented as punishment, and that may have made it even colder. No one needed to raise their voice when the paperwork had already spoken. The message was moving through the system with unmistakable force. Royal legacy would remain royal legacy, and no emotional appeal could be allowed to blur the line. Inside that atmosphere, invitations, access, family expectations, and future courtesies reportedly came under a more cautious eye. The issue was no longer simply whether Camilla's grandchildren had been excluded from certain protections. The deeper concern was whether years of warmth, proximity, and social acceptance had created a quiet belief that the Parker Bowles family might always be shielded by Charles's position. The codicil appeared to answer that question with brutal simplicity. Kindness could remain. Respect could remain. But protection rooted in Windsor inheritance would not expand beyond its rightful boundary. This was where the phrase whispered through palace corridors, the Windsor bloodline firewall, began to take on real meaning. It was not just a dramatic label, it became a strategy of containment. Anne and Edward were reportedly seen as the quiet enforcers of that strategy, not through spectacle, but through discipline. Anne understood the emotional storm, but refused to let emotion become policy. Edward, calm and precise, reportedly supported the legal reading that kept the monarchy from drifting into dangerous ambiguity. Together, they represented a kind of old royal instinct. When the family becomes complicated, the institution must become clearer. William's position, according to insiders, was shaped by the future rather than the present. He reportedly viewed the codicil through the reign that would one day belong to him and the inheritance world that would surround George, Charlotte, and Louis. For him, any uncertainty left behind by Charles could become a burden placed on his children. And William, already preparing for a monarchy under sharper public judgment, could not allow private sympathy to become a future constitutional headache. Camilla, meanwhile, was said to feel increasingly isolated. Not abandoned openly, not humiliated publicly, but surrounded by a palace that had chosen continuity over comfort. Courtiers who had once softened difficult edges now reportedly rallied around institutional clarity. Lawyers warned that reopening the codicil could create more confusion, more leaks, and more suspicion. What Camilla experienced as heartbreak, the palace began to describe as necessity, and that was the true cruelty of the moment. The exclusion became accepted not because it was painless, but because it was considered safer than the alternative. In the royal world, painful policy often survives where personal pleading cannot. But what made the moment truly devastating was not the legal outcome, it was the message it sent about Camilla's place in the story after Charles. Camilla had reached the summit. She had worn the crown, stood beside the king, and survived the judgment of history long enough to be called queen. But the codicil allegedly revealed the one boundary even her triumph could not cross. She could share Charles's throne, his home, and his final years of devotion. But she could not transform her grandchildren into Windsor heirs. And that truth reportedly shattered the illusion of permanence. For Camilla, the tragedy was not that she had lost everything. In many ways, she had gained what once seemed impossible. She had moved from controversy to coronation, from public rejection to royal recognition, from being whispered about in the margins to standing at the very center of the crown. But monarchy has always been cruel at the point where victory appears complete. It allows a person to rise, to be accepted, to be robed in ceremony, and surrounded by deference. And then it quietly reminds them that acceptance is not ownership. A title can be granted, a role can be honored, but the bloodline is guarded by rules older, colder, and more unforgiving than emotion. Reports suggest this was the meaning that settled over the palace once the codicil's implications became clear. Camilla remained queen. No one could erase that. No one could deny the place Charles had given her beside him. Yet the reach of her family was reportedly limited with sudden sharpness. Her children and grandchildren could remain part of her private world, but not part of the Windsor inheritance expectation. They could be treated with courtesy, perhaps even warmth, but they could not be written into the future as though proximity to Charles had made them royal by extension. That was why Anne, William, and Edward reportedly emerged from the crisis, not as aggressors, but as defenders of the crown's future. Anne enforced the old discipline. William protected the reign that would one day shape his children's lives. Edward guarded the fine print, where royal destiny is often decided more permanently than in speeches or ceremonies. Together, they represented the cold institutional answer to Camilla's personal grief. The monarchy could sympathize, but it could not bend. Charles's codicil, in that sense, became more than a private document. It became a final act of protection, a painful attempt to prevent future confusion before it could become conflict. It suggested that Charles, even while torn by love and loyalty, understood the sacred nature of what he had inherited. The crown was never meant to become a private family estate, distributed according to affection, pressure, or blended family expectation. It was a sacred trust held for continuity, for duty, and for the nation. And so the story ended not with a dramatic confrontation, but with something far more royal: silence, legal finality, palace unease, a queen left to understand that her triumph had limits. A family reminded that closeness is not inheritance. A dynasty quietly sealing its gates before the next reign begins. Camilla may keep the title, but not the legacy line. She may remain part of Charles's story, but the future belongs elsewhere, to the Windsor bloodline, to the heirs already chosen by history, and to the duty that outlives every private heartbreak. And in the end, the codicil did more than exclude names from a document. It revealed the coldest truth of monarchy. Love may enter the palace, but only bloodline inherits its future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.